Hey, Steve Guttenberg here. This is the last of the John Atkinson interviews, at least for now. And this one is, we're talking about music, about him being a performer, about his, before he was John Atkinson, when he was just a kid, and he'd go to clubs and see The Who and Yes, in small clubs. He was in the right place at the right time and the right age. So that's what this video is mostly about. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did talking to John, and I hope you enjoyed all 4 of these videos. I will make them into a playlist so you can look at them at your leisure. So let's get to John right now. We're about the same age, but you were in the swinging 60s London, and I was in the swinging New York, which wasn't swinging so much in that time period. I was thinking about that. In 1967, all of it's happening, from my perspective, all of it's happening over there. And in New York, we had the Velvet Underground, the Turtles. There wasn't a lot here. No. It was all over there. Well, but you got to hear it firsthand.
Yeah, I mean, even what should have been over here went over there, like Jimi Hendrix.
Right, exactly.
I mean, Jimi Hendrix just, my God, I mean, you cannot imagine the impact he had on us teenagers in England in the 60s. I mean, I remember going to a festival in 67 and he was headlining and we couldn't get in. So we just stood outside the fence listening to Hendrix quarter mile away. The man was just a monster. I mean, and actually, yes, I grew up in an amazing time. I got my first guitar when I was like 13. I switched to bass guitar when I was 16. And it was a wonderful time because in England, every pub, every club had live music all the time. And so if you formed a band and you're a bunch of 16-year-olds in a band, you could gig 3 or 4 times a week and get paid.
Wow.
But most importantly, by performing on a stage in front of people, you learnt your craft as a not just as a musician, but as a performer.
Yeah.
And you learnt how to tailor your set to what the audience was doing. If the audience attention's flagging, you knew you could, you could up your game a little, change the running order of the songs. You learn how to deal with an audience. And I've been thinking about, here I've been a magazine editor, 2 magazines, Hi-Fi News and Stereophile. That's actually what I did. I tailored what the magazine was doing to suit what the audience wanted to read. Not by dumbing it down, but by making it interesting, by making it varied, by entertaining. And I never forget, I was playing on stage. It must have been 69. We were doing a gig at a college. So it was a big hall. There must have been 700-800 people in the hall, in the audience. And I was playing a bass solo. And it was one of those moments where they describe it as time standing still, or you leave your body. So I'm playing a solo, and I'm looking down at what I'm doing, and I look at the audience, and every pair of eyes is on what I'm doing. It was the most wonderful feeling. Being a magazine editor was the closest I've ever got to recreating that experience.
Somehow it doesn't seem the same.
It is the same. You're still performing.
That's
and you talked about wonderful time back then. So many clubs, so much live music. I mean, we had a club in our town, Emma next to ours, where every Friday and Saturday they would get these bands who now you look back as being iconic, like Georgie Flame and the Boo Flames, Peter Green and Peter Green's
Fleetwood Mac,
The Nice, Chris Farlow and the Thunderbirds, The Move. They play there, and you just go up and watch them, and
no big deal.
No big deal, and they were so accessible, and you heard them all the time, and you got to know them. I mean, I remember going to see Yes for the first time, the pre-pump rock Yes, when they had Peter Banks on guitar, who was great, Tony Kaye on keyboards. They were such a great club band, and they had the sound down there.
It's so mind-warping to think.
Yeah, they had the sound down. Then I went to see them later when they got, replaced Tony Kaye with Rick Wakeman and Tony Banks with Steve Howe, and they were bigger and better, but it still wasn't quite the same as it had been when they were first
What
out.
about the Who?
Oh,
Pre-Tommy Who?
the Who. They again used to play at this club. They were so loud, and yet you look at what they were using. Pete Townsend had his Marshall stack. John Atkinson had a Marshall stack, and they had 2 pairs of Marshall 4x12s for PA, and that was it. No miking on the drums. And they were so loud and so exciting. Oh, those were the days. I remember when I was 18, so I'm growing up in this little town in England, and we come out of school, and I'm walking up to the record shop, and there's these 3 people walking down the street, and I thought, that's Eric Clapton, because I knew him from John Mayall's Blues Breakers.
Uh-huh.
That's Ginger Baker, because I knew him from the Graham Bond organisation, who had played regularly in the next town. And that's Jack Bruce. And I knew Jack Bruce because he was playing at that time with Manfred Mann, and he had given them a jazz edge, which I really liked. And so they were walking down the street. And so I check out this little ballroom in our town, and they weren't called Cream, but they were playing that night, and it was a tryout gig.
Uh-huh.
They blew me away. Jack Bruce on his 6-string Fender. I actually recently looked it up. On Jack Bruce's website, it's got a list of every gig he ever did, and there it was. Hermitage Ballroom, Hitchin, May 66 or something like that. And it was like just being exposed to all that music. I mean, another story, that in 71, 72, a friend of mine was running a youth club in the next town, and he had this brilliant idea. What if we put bands on Monday nights? Because no band has gigs on Monday nights. Right. And so he did this deal. He would get bands in. He would pay them £15, about $25 at that time, versus 50% of the gate. So we got Genesis, we got Mott the Hoople, we got all these great bands, for nothing.
Right.
And they'd come, and it was a Monday night, and I remember we Phil Collins had just joined Genesis, and they'd already had their first album out. And later the band does, and we were playing support for Genesis at a club in London, and they were so good. Sorry, this was before the Phil Collins Genesis episode. This was a year or so earlier, and we were playing support at this club in London, and the main band was Genesis, who we'd never heard of, and there was this singer banging a bass drum with his foot, playing flute. It was Peter Gabriel, and this was, everything was so accessible.
What about
now.
Jethro Tull?
Never saw Jethro Tull. We did see a band called McGregor's Engine, which was what was the guitarist's name? Mick Abrahams. That was his band before Jethro Tull.
Oh, okay.
But
that first Jethro Tull record, which is unlike all the ones that came after.
Yeah, well, Ian Anderson. It was before Ian Anderson took total control. But yeah, everything was so accessible. I think partly it's because England's very small. It's nowhere's more than a 3-hour drive from anywhere else, just about. And it was at such a time where everybody had live music, and then disco came along, and pubs and clubs started having DJs instead of bands. And
never the same.
Never the same.
Yikes. So we had talked about this thing. I was saying there's some bands have like 2 phases. Like Fleetwood Mac would be the easy one, right? Fleetwood Mac, the blues band with Peter Green, and then the California Lindsey Buckingham. And it's amazing that there are some bands like the Who, pre-Tommy and after Tommy. They're the same people in that case, but they're entirely different.
Well,
Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, with Pete Townsend was always the same. I mean,
he was always the same. But
I haven't heard the new album yet, but
they were a pop band pre-Tommy.
No, they were an
like
R&B band pretending to be a pop band. When we saw them live, they were loud, they were vicious, they were exciting.
But on record.
On record, when you listen to Substitute or I'm a Boy,
sounds,
it's a different thing. But the Who were always Pete and Roger's band, and they still are, apparently, according to the reviews of the new album. I last saw them at Madison Square Garden in 2003. That was a tour where John Atkinson died. So Pino Palladino was playing bass for them, Zach Starkey on drums, and it was just like going back to the 60s in the band I saw back then.
And what about the Stones with Brian Jones?
With Brian Jones.
And without Brian Jones?
Yeah. I have a Stone story. So it's 1962, and my father, the company my father worked was having a Christmas dance. So my father booked a band he'd never heard of called the Rolling Stones.
Whoa!
And they didn't have a chart clause. So even though Come On had come out and it was a minor hit and everyone was talking about them, they still had to play at my dad's company's Christmas dance. They were great. They were so good. And of course, Brian Jones was still in the band then, but as history tells us, he got superfluous to requirements.
Yeah.
And it became Mick and Keith's band.
But did you ever see this documentary called Charlie, My Darling?
Yes.
It's a tour of Ireland,
Yeah.
I think, in 65. And when I see that, I see a band of equals, that they were five people that were in a band. And once Brian's out of the picture, it's Mick and Keith with those other guys.
But if it hadn't been for Mick and Keith,
right,
they would have just remained
right. I agree.
a 60s pop band.
Right.
But there's another documentary I saw about Mick and Keith, that they were appearing on the Dick Clark show, and they insisted their price for appearing on the Dick Clark show was that he hire Howlin' Wolf. Because, Dick Clark, very white, very Philadelphia, but the Stones knew the American R&B singers, Howlin' Wolf, Muddy Waters. So when they came to America, they wanted to be with the people, appear with the people they respected and admired. So Howlin' Wolf goes on the Dick Clark show. And that's such a great story because, again, America in the 60s didn't know what it was producing. This wonderful, wonderful music coming out of Chicago and out of Detroit. But ignored by mainstream America because it was the wrong race.
Right.
But in England, these people were gods. I remember going to see Otis Redding in 65.
Oh, wow.
The man was a monster. I wanted to be Otis Redding.
That's so great.
I mean, I remember, we were talking about Ken Kessler, the writer Ken Kessler. Ken Kessler, when he and Betty had their son, they called him Samuel David because Ken was in love with Sam and Dave back in those times.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it was, and everything that came out of Motown. I mean,
oh my God.
Yes, I mean, you never heard anything like it. And then, you find out who the musicians were. James Jamerson on bass, a monster, God, I mean, England, when I wasn't wanting to be Otis Redding, I wanted to be James Jamerson.
Yeah.
And of course you had Bob Dylan happening at that time, who again, it's not fair to say he came to the UK to make his fortune, to become famous. Although some did. I remember a little folk club in the village, the town I grew up in. Let's call it village. It's a little more than a village. But they had a folk club by the railway station every Sunday night. And one night they had this American guy on, completely unknown. So we all went along to see him. It was Paul Simon, who had gone to the UK to tour because he couldn't make it in. Tom and Jerry had fallen apart, and so he toured England as a folk singer. And then, of course, Sound of Silence came out, and we were all going, that's that guy we saw at the folk club the other night.
Did you ever see Dylan there?
Never seen Dylan. I tell a lie. Only time I ever saw Dylan, it was kind of sad. It was in Santa Fe in the late 90s, and we all knew the words to his songs better than he did. Which was sad. I mean, it was a good band. It was a Saturday Night Live band who was backing him back then. Yeah, but he was disappointing.
Yeah,
although,
he's disappointing a lot.
But props to him. He's still touring. Still doing 200 shows a year.
Made his Christmas record. He's good.
Yeah.
He made the Frank Sinatra record, which is actually, I like that record.
Okay.
He's not trying to sound like Frank Sinatra, but he's putting something into those songs. There's songs associated with Frank Sinatra that there's like, you feel like he's being sincere, and that's not a thing you usually apply to Bob Dylan. Sincerity.
I mean, he was a monstrous talent. I mean, listen. I mean, when Highway 61 came out, we played it over and over because we couldn't believe the depth of the lyrics. You know, you listen to Desolation Row. My goodness.
All right, thanks, John. I think we're good.
You're welcome. Yeah, I mean, now you make me feel like an old man.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll stop now. You can go back to feeling young.
Yeah.
Anyway.
You can talk to my son in 40 years and he'll tell you about Billie Eilish and
Well, those are the good
and
old
Lizzie
days.
and the good old days.
Yeah, and the 20 teens. That's when music was music.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, see you guys soon. Bye-bye.